Dimensional Trader in Marvel Chapter 21. Tracking, I want a divorce. Hearing Margaret's words, to be honest, Josh was a bit confused. If you want to leave, just leave. Why tell me? We've only known each other for a few days, sister. Of course, even though Josh had never been married in his previous life, it didn't mean he was slow to pick up on such matters. If he spoke his mind directly, the goodwill he had built with Margaret so far might not drop to zero instantly, but it would surely take a big hit. From what you've said, it seems like he doesn't really love you. When he married you back then, it was probably for your immense wealth. It's good to get a divorce sooner rather than later anyway. You're still young, and you have a bright future ahead of you. There's no need to waste it on someone like that. After Margaret vented her frustrations, Josh comforted her. His words were sincere. As long as Margaret wasn't lying, it was obvious what kind of person Tony Windus was. He used his fame as a sports star to sweep young Margaret off her feet, dazzling her. When Margaret's father was still alive, he behaved well at home, acting like a model husband. But after Margaret's father passed away, and once he realized Margaret was easier to manipulate, things changed. He traveled around the world under the pretense of participating in competitions. Of course, he did compete, but in between, he indulged in debauchery. His performance in competitions was sharply decreasing, comparable to a certain soccer team. But he didn't care because Margaret had money. Why would Margaret keep someone like that around? Plus, even though she's been married to him for 7 years, Margaret is only 26 years old. When that guy started going after her, she was just 18, and they married when she was 19. After Josh's comforting words, Margaret's mood improved significantly compared to when she arrived, and her resolve to divorce grew stronger. However, as noon approached, she was ready to say goodbye to Josh. Not staying for lunch? Josh asked, somewhat surprised. No, I have an appointment with Uncle John at noon to discuss the matter of your gold. Also, I need his help with my divorce. Margaret explained. Josh understood and immediately offered to drive her. But Margaret politely declined, saying she could handle these things herself. She only asked Josh to walk her to the door. Watching Margaret drive away, Josh returned to the house, ready to go out as well. Over the past 2 days, because of the move and his dates with Margaret, he hadn't been able to get much done during the day. As a result, he could only chat with Daenerys during the trading hours at night. That wouldn't do. It was time to restock inventory, and he also needed to prepare the books Daenerys had requested. Just as he was about to leave, his neighbor Tommy called out to him. Is something wrong, Tommy? Josh asked, puzzled. Yeah, I just wanted to ask if Margaret has offended anyone recently. Tommy organized his thoughts before asking. Why do you ask? Josh was confused by the question. When Margaret came over earlier, I noticed a black car parked across the street. It seemed to be watching your place, but at the time, I wasn't entirely sure. Just now, when Margaret left, that same car followed her. That's when I realized the car must be tailing Margaret. Tommy quickly explained the situation to Josh and gave him the car's license plate number. What? Someone's tailing Margaret. Josh was stunned. Then came the anxiety. Although they hadn't known each other long, and Josh had initially intended to use her to some extent, he was well aware of Margaret's kindness and help toward him. He wasn't a heartless or ungrateful person. He couldn't just stand by when Margaret might be in danger. He immediately thanked Tommy and drove off in the direction Margaret had gone. Since some time had passed since Margaret left, it would be nearly impossible to catch up with her under normal circumstances. And in this era, there were no mobile phones or pagers, so Josh had no way of contacting her. Fortunately, when they discussed Uncle John earlier, Margaret had mentioned the name and address of the jewelry company. If he went there, he should either run into Margaret or at least be able to ask about her and John's whereabouts. Josh could only hope that if someone was indeed following Margaret, they wouldn't act too soon. As Josh drove away, Tommy watched him leave, reminded of his younger, more energetic self. But he quickly shook his head. Back then, he had started from nothing, a penniless refugee. It had taken him decades of hard work to afford his current home. This young man was starting off at a much higher point than he ever did. Besides, Tommy's past was filled with shady dealings, the kind that made people despise him. There's no comparing, no comparing. Josh sped down the road, but a traffic cop flagged him down. After all, Roosevelt's administration wasn't just for show. However, the anxious Josh pulled out some cash. When he encountered a cop, he casually tossed out a $100 bill. In this era, there were no body cams, and corruption among federal officers was rampant. But at any time, a patrol officer's salary was one of the lowest. $100 was more than what they'd usually make in a month on the side. So Josh drove on unimpeded and soon arrived at the building where the jewelry company was located. After driving around the parking lot, Josh finally spotted the familiar Packard. His previously tense nerves relaxed a little. Since the car was here, it meant Margaret hadn't encountered any danger on the way. This was downtown, and even if someone planned to act, they wouldn't likely do it here. So Margaret should be safe for now. With that thought, Josh didn't rush out of the car. Instead, he drove a bit further, parked in a discreet spot, and cautiously returned to observe the area around the Packard. This was a business district parking lot, with security patrolling regularly, so he wasn't too worried about the car being stolen. Plus, he was driving a Lincoln, a luxury car that few thieves would target because it would be difficult to sell. After carefully observing, Josh spotted the black sedan. But when he saw who was in the car, Josh was taken aback. It was the Italian guy who had stolen his car a few days ago. What was he doing here? Josh frowned. After thinking it over, he stepped back. It wasn't that he didn't want to do anything, but cars and people were coming and going frequently, and it wasn't very discreet. Since they were watching Margaret, he would watch them. With that thought, Josh returned to his hiding spot, making sure no one was around, and stashed his Lincoln in his system's storage. He then replaced it with a regular car he had previously borrowed. Chapter 22. Recognized. In the parking lot of the business district, Joe's attention was fully focused on the people entering and exiting the office building, waiting for Margaret to come down. He had no idea that he was already exposed. Going upstairs was out of the question. Even in the 1940s, security in a business district like this was relatively tight. Without proper preparation, it was difficult to sneak in. So Joe had no choice but to wait in the parking lot. After about half an hour, Margaret finally came downstairs. But she wasn't alone. Leading the way was a sharp, energetic older gentleman, probably in his 50s or 60s. If nothing else, this should be the Uncle John Margaret had mentioned. Margaret followed close behind, but to his surprise, she was also accompanied by a very attentive young man. Behind the three of them were two stern men in long coats, probably bodyguards. Seeing this, Joe quickly and discreetly took out his camera and snapped a few pictures. At this point, Margaret and her companions got into a car. This time, Margaret didn't get into her own car. Instead, she joined Uncle John and the attentive young man in another vehicle. The young man drove while Margaret and Uncle John sat in the back seat. The two bodyguards got into a separate car and followed them. After the cars drove a short distance, Joe started his car and began following them. Josh, who had been watching from a distance, didn't hesitate either. He slowly started his car and followed as well. This was the first time Josh had tried to tail someone, and he wasn't entirely confident. But his focus remained on following Joe and Margaret and avoiding detection by her bodyguards. Fortunately, Joe didn't notice Josh following him from behind. In fact, Josh was lucky. On Tony Windus's orders, Brian of the Irish gang had vouched for him, and part of the $1,000 reward had been used to pay off some of his debts. This had caused the Scappa's men, who had been tailing Joe, to call off their surveillance. If they were still around, Josh, with his limited experience in surveillance, would probably have been discovered much sooner. Josh followed them for most of the day. Margaret and her group first went to a fancy restaurant for lunch. Afterwards, they returned to a jewelry company to conduct business. This went on until about 3 p.m., when the attentive young man finally dropped Margaret off downstairs. After saying goodbye, Margaret got into her own car and drove away. Joe Barbaro, the man who had been following her, persisted in following her, and Josh was no exception. But this time, Margaret seemed to be heading toward Josh's house. Along the way, Joe Barbaro kept a good distance, looking like he was just tailing her. But Josh had no intention of letting Joe off the hook so easily. Although the area was a satellite city, there was still a stretch of uninhabited land between Chicago and Josh's home in Evanston. There were cars on the road, but it was much less crowded than the city. In this deserted area, Josh put on a mask, stepped on the gas, and caught up to Joe Barbaro's car. Timing his move perfectly, he veered left and rammed Joe's car on the driver's side. In both America and China, the driver's seat is on the left, so Josh's maneuver hit Joe Barbaro directly. The impact knocked Joe Barbaro unconscious for a few seconds, and his car lost control, crashing into the farmland on the right side of the road and flipping over. Seeing the success of his move, Josh didn't hesitate to follow him into the field. Since it was late winter, the farmland was just barren ground, and the cold, hard soil made it easy for Josh to drive his car steadily up to Joe Barbaro's overturned vehicle. Joe Barbaro was no fool. Although disoriented from the crash, he still had the sense to reach for the gun hidden under the passenger seat. But before he could grab it, a cold, large barrel of a gun was pressed against the back of his head. Joe Barbaro had no choice but to raise his hands in surrender. "Get out." With a calm but commanding voice, Josh pulled the gun back slightly, but Joe still didn't dare make any sudden moves. Joe was familiar with guns, and from the feel of the gun against his head, he knew that Josh was holding a powerful short-range weapon, a shotgun. At close range, this thing was deadlier than any other weapon. The phrase, "within 10 meters, all or gun equal," was no joke. Faced with this, Joe Barbaro abandoned all thoughts of resistance and obediently crawled out of the shattered car window. By now, several cars on the distant highway had noticed the situation. But when they saw Josh, masked and holding a shotgun, they all hit the gas and sped away. As for the police, in this day and age without cell phones or pagers, it would take at least half an hour for them to reach this remote area after being notified. When Joe Barbaro crawled out, he finally saw that the person pointing the gun at him was a tall, thin man wearing a mask. But why did the mask look so familiar? "Is that you?" In the next second, Joe Barbaro recognized the figure, his eyes widening in shock. He couldn't help it, Josh had made a deep impression on him. If Josh hadn't stolen his car, Joe wouldn't be in his current predicament. But what luck to run into that guy again. "I didn't provoke him this time, did I?" Joe thought to himself. "Who told you to follow that woman?" Josh asked coldly, not interested in small talk. Hearing Josh's question, Joe Barbaro finally realized that the task Tony Windus had given him wasn't as easy as he thought. Otherwise, he wouldn't have attracted the attention of this mysterious figure. But what was the connection between this man and the woman he was following? Suddenly, Joe Barbaro remembered seeing a young man in Evanston earlier that morning while he was following Margaret. "Speak. Who told you to follow that woman?" Josh demanded again when he saw Joe Barbaro lost in thought. "It was Mr. Tony Windus. He asked me to follow Mrs. Windus to gather evidence of her affair and to find out the identity of her lover." Faced with the barrel of a gun, Joe Barbaro didn't hesitate to betray his employer. Men like him had no principles. As long as it meant staying alive or making money, they would do anything. But when Joe mentioned the word lover, his tone changed slightly, and his probing look at Josh was noticed by Josh. Had he recognized Josh? Josh frowned. At first he had only wanted to teach this Italian fatso a lesson and find out why Margaret was being followed. He hadn't intended to kill anyone. But if Joe had really recognized him. "This gentleman, Joe Barbaro began, trying to test the waters with Josh. But bang! A gunshot rang out, echoing across the field. Chapter 23. The telephone murder case. When the police arrived at the car accident scene, it was already half an hour later. Any findings? A burly man in plain clothes got out of the car and asked a police officer in uniform standing nearby. His name was Dietrich, a lieutenant sheriff of the Chicago North District's 3rd Precinct. As a federal country, the United States has never had a unified police rank system since its founding, and it's common to see military ranks used interchangeably with police ranks. The Chicago area isn't as large as it will be in the future, so there are only 13 precincts at present. Dietrich, as the second in command of the 3rd Precinct, held an influential position. There are some bloodstains, tire tracks, footprints, and some bloodied bullets, probably deer hunting pellets, but no eggshells, and no sign of the car or the body. What's strange is that although there are traces of 2 cars at the scene, we only found the tire tracks of 1 car leaving. The other car seems to have never existed. The police officer, looking a bit uneasy, reported. Witnesses? Lieutenant Dietrich asked. We found the person who called in, but they only saw a figure holding a gun from a distance and didn't approach, so they couldn't even tell if the killer was male or female. The officer sighed helplessly. Dietrich nodded, understanding the officer's frustration. No body, no weapon, no witnesses, and not even any substantial evidence. In an era with limited investigative tools, this case was basically a cold one. Pack up and go. I'll speak to the chief. After surveying the scene, Dietrich ordered the team to leave. Similar cold cases were too common, and the police didn't want to waste too much energy on them. While the police were reluctantly packing up, having found no leads, Josh, who had changed into new clothes, drove the Lincoln Continental that Margaret had helped him buy and just arrived home. Seeing the Packard parked in front of his house, Josh knew that Margaret was in his home. He had left her a spare key when he moved. How did it go? As Josh got out of the car, Tommy, who happened to be coming out of his house, walked over and asked. A small problem, already solved. Thanks for the help, Josh replied. Of course, he couldn't go into specifics. Tommy, understanding the unspoken rules, didn't ask further. He simply accepted Josh's thanks, nodded, and returned inside. Watching Tommy go inside, Josh sighed lightly. If one paid close attention, they would notice his hands were still trembling slightly. The reason was simple. He had killed someone. It was his first time. The image of a gunshot to the body, the blood and flesh splattering, still lingered in his mind. Even the bloodied body, the shotgun, and the 2 cars involved in the incident were quietly stored in the system's warehouse. There was no supernatural thrill. No overwhelming fear either. Just a sense of nervousness and confusion. Josh still didn't understand why he was so decisive while pulling the trigger and so calm in handling the situation. Josh, where have you been? I've been waiting for you. Margaret's voice interrupted his thoughts as she came out of the door. Seeing him standing there absent-mindedly, she asked with a hint of curiosity. Then, she noticed the strange look Josh gave her. What's wrong? Did my makeup smudge? Margaret asked, feeling a little uncomfortable under Josh's gaze. Before she could say anything else, Josh swiftly picked her up and carried her inside. By the time Margaret came to her senses, she was lying on the bed, naked. T.N. My boy got Riz lying in Josh's arms, staring at his youthful, handsome face. Margaret felt something strange and complicated in her heart. T.N. Author skipped the S*X, but it was also very refreshing. This was something she had never felt with Tony. What happened? Margaret gently stroked Josh's face, asking softly. Your husband sent someone to follow you all day and took a lot of photos, Josh casually replied while caressing Margaret's body. No wonder people say women are the best emotional regulators. After some wild passion, Josh's pent-up negative emotions had been fully released, and he regained his usual calm. He then told Margaret about Tony Windus sending someone to follow her. Josh didn't have the habit of being an unsung hero. If you make an effort, you should speak up, otherwise, no one will know what you've done. Of course, he left out the fact that he had killed someone, only saying that he had used money to bribe the person following her. What? How dare he? Hearing this, Margaret instantly became angry. Hey, why wouldn't he dare? Not only did he dare send someone to follow you, but he even sent someone to kill you. Otherwise, he'd wait until after the divorce to get kicked out by you, right? Josh said with a hint of mockery, though the mockery was aimed at Tony Windus, not Margaret. To be fair, in this matter, he's quite decisive. If you were dead, your vast fortune would all belong to him. But how did Josh know about Tony Windus' plan? After all, Joe Barbaro had only been carrying out the first step of Tony Windus' tracking plan. The subsequent plans weren't even shared with Joe Barbaro. So, Josh shouldn't have known that Tony Windus wanted to kill Margaret. Why did Josh say this then? Because, as he was making love with Margaret earlier, Josh finally remembered where the sense of familiarity with her came from when they first met. Margot. Wendus, a rich girl. Tony Wendus, a tennis star. Wendus is the surname used in the real movie, but in this translation I used Windus. These were characters from the Hitchcock movie Dial M for Murder. T.N. Real movie. Josh knew about this movie because the actress who played Margaret was Grace Kelly. When people think of famous 1950s Hollywood actresses, the first names that come to mind are Audrey Hepburn and Marilyn Monroe. However, in the 1950s, there was an actress who outshone both of them. That actress was Grace Kelly. The reason she's not as famous today as the other two is simple. After achieving fame, she married into the Monaco royal family and became a princess. In the hearts of the people of Monaco, her status was as important as Princess Diana's to the British people. Josh had only watched this movie by chance, so the impression wasn't very deep, which is why he couldn't recall it immediately. But once he remembered, Josh finally realized that he might not have traveled to the original world's World War II era, but rather to a parallel world. And the current situation had a lot of differences from the movie's plot. For example, the movie's story took place in London, not Chicago. Furthermore, an important character was missing: Margaret's lover, Mark. However, thinking about his current relationship with Margaret, it seemed like he had already replaced that guy. Also, the movie's story took place in the early 1950s, which was 10 years later than now. Chapter 24. Conspiracy. When Margaret heard that Tony Windus wanted to kill her, she was terrified and immediately tried to stand up, but was stopped by Josh. "What are you going to do?" Josh asked. "Of course, I'm going to call the police," Margaret said in a panic. "Call the police? And then what? Tell them your husband is trying to kill you. Do you have any evidence?" Josh rolled his eyes. "But you said he sent someone to follow me and plan my murder, right?" "That person can testify," Margaret said, regaining some composure. "It's useless. Although I paid him off, he made it very clear that he can't come forward to testify against your husband because he's a member of the mafia. Your husband didn't hire him directly but hired his boss. Do you understand now?" Josh half lied, half truthfully explained. "Besides, if there's no accident, he's already taken the money I gave him and left Chicago. What should I do then? He surely won't just give up." After hearing Josh's explanation, Margaret realized that calling the police wouldn't do anything to Tony Windus. But as long as they weren't officially divorced, Tony probably wouldn't let her go. No, based on Tony's ruthlessness, even if she successfully divorced him, he would probably still try to get revenge on her. "It's simple: strike first, or suffer the consequences later," Josh said softly. "What?" Margaret was shocked by Josh's words. Although the information Josh had revealed made Margaret both hate and fear her husband, the idea of murder was still too distant for her, something she had never considered. But then she thought about it. Perhaps this was actually a very good solution. It must be said that everyone harbors a demon within them. The key is whether anyone releases it. "But what should we do? And this is illegal. Josh, we're still young. If the police find out, it will ruin us." Although Margaret was tempted, as a law-abiding citizen, she still felt fear and resistance toward such a serious crime like murder. "I understand, my dear, but I'm not saying we should do it ourselves. Since he can buy off the mafia, we can do the same. After all, there are countless unsolved cases in the US every year. If we make him disappear quietly, no one will ever know what happened." Josh whispered in her ear like a devil as he held her perfect, tempting body. Although Josh talked about buying the mafia, in his heart, he had already decided to do it himself. Because for Josh, with the advantage of the dimensional trading system, it was much easier to eliminate all traces and evidence by doing it himself than hiring a hitman. In the US, where evidence is the primary basis of law, as long as there is no body, no weapon, and no complete evidence chain, it's hard to convict someone, even if someone knows you did it. If you don't admit it, it's difficult to prove your guilt. If this were before today, Josh wouldn't have made such a decision so easily. Clearly, the gunshot Josh fired earlier had opened Pandora's box in his heart. Vigilantes break the law. When a person possesses abilities beyond the ordinary and crosses their moral boundary, it becomes very hard to return to the right path. At this point, it was difficult for Josh to resist any longer. But, even though Josh's words made Margaret waver, it wasn't easy for her to make such a decision. But Josh didn't want to waste more time. He directly silenced all of Margaret's remaining words by giving her a French kiss. Soon, Margaret was completely lost in Josh's youthful, energetic body. The key was that Josh was not only physically young but also skilled. He hadn't wasted the 30-plus years of his past life. Margaret, who seemed mature but lacked much experience, was no match for him. All she could do was feel her mind go blank. That night, Margaret didn't even go home. They were going at it all night. The next morning, Josh and Margaret, like a newlywed couple, happily had breakfast together. If we go with your idea, how much do you think it will cost? And how should we contact someone trustworthy to do this? Margaret asked quietly. It's often said that even heroes can't escape the charm of a beautiful woman. In this case, the reverse was also true. And since women are often more emotional, once they fall in, it's harder for them to get out than for men. Margaret was in that situation. She was already an emotional person, otherwise, she wouldn't have easily fallen for Tony, ignoring her father's strong objections, and married him. If Tony hadn't gone too far over the years, they wouldn't have ended up like this. Now, being with Josh made Margaret feel deeply intoxicated. All she wanted now was to be with him. So Tony Windus became the biggest obstacle in her way. Money won't cost too much. A few thousand, maybe 10,000, at most. As for the person, I believe there are many people in immigrant communities or refugee camps who would be willing. Leave this to me, Josh said without hesitation, taking charge of the whole matter. All right, I'll cover the money. I'll go to the bank later. Margaret nodded. Josh didn't refuse. With Margaret providing the money and Josh handling the work, they were truly in this together. It wasn't that Josh was dark-hearted, but having such a secret bond them was far more stable for their relationship than just emotions or physical attraction alone. After breakfast, they both left the house and headed to the bank. You know what I just remembered? Margaret asked while watching Josh drive. What? Josh asked. Thelma and Louise. Margaret replied. Josh couldn't help but twitch his lips. Although the movie, Thelma and Louise, hadn't been made yet, it was based on a real-life story from the Great Depression era in the US, and was widely known. There was even a mental disorder named after the two. But the comparison wasn't exactly fortunate. After all, this couple ended up getting shot down. Chapter 25. Shopping. Here's 50,000. Outside the bank, Margaret handed a large brown paper bag to Josh as she got into the car. Hearing the amount, Josh's hand trembled slightly as he almost dropped the bag. He opened it. To find 5 stacks of $100 bills. Why so much? Josh asked, slightly confused. Didn't he say 1,000, or at most a few thousand, would be enough? And Margaret, really, aren't you worried about getting robbed? Is it too much? Well, just spend what you need. Keep the extra. A man always needs money for something. It's never a bad thing to have some extra on hand, Margaret said with a kiss on his cheek, speaking warmly. Just that one line nearly broke Josh's resolve. What a wonderful woman. Compared to those who are constantly asking for cars or houses, Josh couldn't help but feel grateful to Tony Windus for causing so much trouble. If it weren't for Tony, a woman like Margaret would never have been available to him. As a return gesture, Josh decided to make Tony Windus' death a painful one to vent Margaret's frustrations. He nodded, accepting the money without any refusal. Margaret was pleased, thinking that Josh had fully accepted her, unlike before when he insisted on paying her. By the way, let's go buy some clothes. Your wardrobe needs an upgrade. Those clothes are no match for your handsome face. Oh, and we need to get you new shoes too. Margaret excitedly linked her arm with Josh's. All right, I'll go with whatever you choose. Josh nodded. He didn't care much about clothes, but he couldn't bring himself to refuse this sweet and charming lady. But I don't have any clothing vouchers left, Josh said. Just like sugar and gasoline, even in America at that time, clothes and shoes had to be bought with specific clothing coupons. Since 1942, every federal citizen received 24 clothing vouchers per year to purchase clothes and shoes. It may sound like a lot, but one clothing voucher didn't get you very far. For example, a coat required 18 vouchers, a full suit 26 vouchers, a pair of shoes 9 vouchers, slippers 5 vouchers, a slip undergarment dress 3 vouchers, pants 8 vouchers, a bra 3 vouchers, and so on. In other words, 24 clothing vouchers weren't enough to buy a complete outfit from head to toe. Shoes were even more strictly controlled and could only be bought twice a year per person. If you wanted more, you had to buy secondhand. Some things, like stockings, were even harder to find. Yes, stockings. A somewhat amusing fact for later generations is that during World War II, stockings were considered as crucial as sugar and gasoline. Why? Because of parachutes. Before the war, the primary material for American parachutes was not nylon, but silk, which came from Asia. But after the war with Japan, the silk supply was cut off, so parachutes were made from nylon. This led to all nylon manufacturers, including DuPont, being forced by the federal government to stop making stockings and other nylon products, focusing solely on military supplies like parachutes. From then on, civilian stockings became scarce and their prices skyrocketed, reaching up to $20 a pair during the war. At the peak of the war, the price even hit an astounding $4,000. This was a price that even 21st century celebrities wouldn't dare ask for. Still, the demand for nylon remained high. So the military launched a campaign to solicit donations from civilians, even advertising with photos of handsome soldiers to encourage women to give up their stockings. It was absurd. What was even more absurd, according to an FBI report, during the war, the most commonly stolen items from American homes weren't dollars, gold, or valuables, but alcohol, stockings, and shoes. This was why Josh had been wearing an ill-fitting coat, as it was a piece left by his father. Even when he stole or borrowed cars, and when he tracked and killed Joe Barbaro, most of the clothes he wore were old clothes, so he didn't mind burning them. He had only recently bought a few new sets when he had some money to spare, using up all the clothing vouchers from the past 2 years. Josh's gaze shifted to Margaret's smooth thigh, and he couldn't resist running his hand over it. Margaret had been wearing stockings yesterday, but he had torn them off in the heat of the moment, and now he felt a twinge of regret. This place is crowded. Don't make a scene. Don't worry about the vouchers, we won't need them, Margaret said, then leaned in close to Josh's ear and whispered, but if you really can't wait, we can find a more private spot. Her soft whisper sent a shiver down Josh's spine. This woman really knew how to tempt him. He shook his head, reminding himself that he was still growing and shouldn't overdo it. So, he ignored Margaret's suggestion and drove the car toward the destination she had given. When they arrived, Josh found that the place Margaret mentioned wasn't a regular shopping mall. It was a high-end bespoke tailor shop, the kind Josh had only heard about in his previous life. But during this time, bespoke shops weren't as pretentious as they would later become, and ready-made clothes were still available. After some work from the tailor, Margaret helped Josh pick out 3 suits, and they also ordered 3 custom-made ones. In the end, they didn't use vouchers but instead paid with thick stacks of cash. Of course, Margaret's social connections as a Chicago socialite played a part in this. So-called material shortages and limited supplies mostly applied to ordinary citizens with no power. After buying the clothes, they went to a shoe store, where the same transaction took place. They also visited a watch shop, where they spent thousands on a Breguet watch. Although Breguet's fame had been overshadowed by brands like Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin in later years, during this period, Breguet was the unrivaled king of watches. And now, Breguet not only made watches and aviation instruments but even built fighter jets. After all the shopping and fitting, Josh looked completely refreshed, with a sharp new look that complemented his handsome face and tall figure. With the confidence of someone who had traveled from another time, his entire aura seemed elevated. From a regular handsome guy, he had transformed into a modern-day aristocrat. As the saying goes, clothes maketh thee man. The ancient wisdom was right. Chapter 26. Don't drink and drive. It was another night, and Tony Windus found himself at the chicken farm once again. Any news about Joe? Tony Windus asked the doorman. No, sir. He hasn't come by since that day, the doorman replied with a shake of his head. He then added, looking for Mary and Nancy again tonight. Hearing that Joe was still a no-show, Tony Windus frowned. He had made plans with Joe, and the first step of their work was supposed to be completed within 3 days. But now it was already the 4th day, and there was still no sign of him. Could that guy have run off? It didn't seem likely. While Tony had already handed over some money, $200 for expenses and another $1,000 to the Moretti family's scapa, the full payment had yet to be given. There was no way Joe would flee halfway through. Unless, something had gone wrong. Thinking about his wife's recent behavior, Tony noted that apart from one night when she stayed out and refused to let him into the bedroom, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. In fact, she appeared less angry lately and hadn't brought up divorce again. That was a good sign. It meant he didn't need to act in haste. Sir, shall I call Mary and Nancy for you? The doorman's reminder pulled Tony Windus out of his thoughts. Oh, not now. Is Brian here? Tony waved his hand dismissively. Brian's in the back, the doorman replied. Prepare the usual private room for me. Get me a bottle of whiskey and ask Brian to come over. Tony instructed, handing over a $10 tip. Of course, right away. The doorman happily obliged. While this chicken farm was Chicago's largest, generous customers like Tony Windus were rare. T.N. Chicken farm is an alternative word for brothels. Soon, in the private room, Tony was joined by Brian, a burly Irishman with a somewhat fierce expression. Good evening, Tony, my friend. You called for me. Brian greeted him with a wide grin. Who's your friend? You wish. Yes, Mr. Brian. Do you remember that Joe Barbaro you met a few days ago? Tony asked, suppressing his disdain. Oh, of course, that smelly little Italian fatty. You even vouched for him. What's up? Did he mess things up? I told you, if you need something done, come to me. Those Italians are unreliable. Brian's voice was loud, and his words were filled with contempt for Italians. Maybe you're right, but this matter can't be left unresolved. He's gone missing, and I need you to find him. Consider this your fee. Tony placed an envelope on the table, forcing a calm demeanor despite his disgust. As a true Englishman, Tony disliked Italians, but he loathed the Irish even more. Equality. That was just a slogan. This country had never truly known equality. The English looked down on the Irish. The Germans looked down on the French. The French looked down on the Italians. Everyone looked down on someone. And all whites collectively discriminated against people of color. Ha ha ha. Mr. Windus, you're too kind. I'll make arrangements immediately. Once I find that fatty, I'll deliver him to you, Brian said, taking the envelope. After checking its contents, his smile grew even broader, though the scars on his face made his expression more menacing. Go. Tony waved him off impatiently. Brian didn't mind. People like him grew up in environments filled with discrimination, so small acts of disrespect didn't bother them, as long as they got paid. Once Brian left, Tony finally called for the two women and indulged himself until the early morning hours. He didn't stay the night, though he could have. As a somewhat prominent figure, it wouldn't look good if he were seen leaving during the day. Unknown to him, his predictable movements played right into the hands of Josh, who had been tailing him for 2 days. Unlike his last target, Joe Barbaro, Tony hadn't shown any intention of leaving the city. Margaret's estate was in the quiet north side, which was still part of Chicago, unlike Evanston, which required traversing desolate outskirts. Moreover, as a wealthy area, police patrols were frequent. Any action taken during normal hours would risk detection, making a clean getaway difficult. But early morning was different. At that hour, with the cold biting hard, unless there was an emergency, nobody, including the underpaid Chicago police, would venture out to freeze themselves. In Chicago, the wee hours were dominated by organized crime groups, be it the Italian mafia or other gangs. Tony Windus, as drunk as a skunk, had no idea he was being followed. The doorman noticed a car trailing Tony but thought little of it. Coincidences happen. In his line of work, it was best not to meddle. Curiosity often ended with a swim in Lake Michigan. As Josh trailed Tony's car, he waited for the perfect spot to strike. A deserted park ahead. But before they got there, something unexpected happened. At an intersection, Josh watched as Tony's car swerved and crashed into a parked vehicle. Josh. See, that's what happens when you drink and drive. Of course, the DUI laws wouldn't exist until the 1970s, so technically, Tony wasn't breaking any rules. This crash, however, thwarted Josh's plans, until he noticed something in his rearview mirror. 4 men in shabby suits emerged from the parked car, swearing loudly. Clearly, they weren't there by accident but had been staking out the area. Josh quickly pieced it together. At this hour, parked and waiting. They were likely planning something illegal. He parked his car at a nearby corner, donned a mask and gloves, and stashed his vehicle in his system storage before quietly coming back. By the time he returned, Tony had been dragged out of his car and was being beaten mercilessly on the roadside. After venting their anger, the 4 men rifled through Tony's belongings, taking his wallet and watch, before returning to their car. But when they tried to start it, the car wouldn't budge. Furious, they turned their attention to Tony's car, only to find it unusable too. Enraged, they gave Tony another beating before retrieving some items. Guns. From their trunk. Looking around, Josh spotted a high-end jewelry store nearby. Ah, so that's the target. Tony's luck couldn't have been worse. These men had been planning a heist, only to have him ruin it. With their getaway vehicle out of commission, the gang had no choice but to abandon their plan. Once the men left, and the street was deserted, Josh approached the battered Tony. Though unconscious, Tony was still breathing. Without hesitation, Josh grabbed Tony's head and smashed it against the ground. The sound of his skull hitting the pavement echoed through the cold, quiet night. With that, Josh walked away, leaving the scene. Once far enough, he retrieved his car and disappeared into the darkness. While Tony's disappearance wasn't complete, Josh doubted the police could trace anything back to him. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no weapon, and no evidence. This wasn't a solvable case, especially in 1940s Chicago. The four men, with their criminal intentions, were perfect scapegoats. Later, Margaret could apply pressure as a grieving widow, ensuring the case quietly closed. Josh couldn't help but reflect. Never drink and drive. It had saved him a lot of trouble this time. Chapter 27. So many good people ring. Ring. The shrill sound of the phone jolted Margaret from her sleep. She turned on the bedside lamp and glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Who would call at this hour? Her confusion didn't last long. Margaret quickly remembered her beloved sweetheart. Without hesitation, she picked up the phone. Hello. Margaret greeted tentatively. It's me, Margaret, came Josh's voice on the other end. Josh, why are you calling so late? Is there any news about the matter? Margaret's voice trembled slightly as she confirmed that it was him. Yes, there is news. But it has nothing to do with us, Josh replied, his tone strange, though Margaret didn't notice. I see. It has nothing to do with us, Margaret took a deep breath and replied. No, Margaret, I mean it literally. Tony Windus is dead, but it wasn't our doing. Josh clarified bluntly and recounted the incident. Of course, he carefully left out the part where he had lent a hand. As long as that detail remained hidden, even if the call was monitored, Tony Windus's death wouldn't implicate Josh. The police would easily conclude that Tony was driving drunk, crashed into another car, got into a conflict, and was accidentally killed. Upon hearing Josh's explanation, Margaret was stunned for a moment, but soon joy overwhelmed her. Although she had decided to get rid of Tony, as a former good girl, she couldn't help but feel uneasy about it. But now Tony was dead, and it had nothing to do with her. This realization lifted an immense weight from her chest. Josh, I miss you. A delighted Margaret began to talk sweetly on the phone, completely ignoring the fact that the deceased was her husband. Baby, I miss you too, but now is not the time. I suspect the police will visit you in the morning. When they do, put some pressure on them to wrap up this case quickly. Once it's closed, we can be together openly. Josh comforted her over the phone. Margaret agreed. The two exchanged sweet talk for a while before reluctantly ending the call. After hanging up, Margaret, still intoxicated, didn't feel like going back to sleep. She happily opened a bottle of champagne. Sipping alone, Margaret suddenly remembered something. Her late husband had taken out several insurance policies as a tennis player. Now that he was dead, wouldn't she receive a substantial payout? Previously, Margaret hadn't considered this because Josh had planned to make Tony disappear. And with mere disappearances, insurance companies could deny claims because there was no proof of death. But now, if Tony was officially declared an accidental death, and the policy didn't have a third-party exclusion clause, the insurance company would have to pay the full amount. A third-party exclusion clause in a contract prevents parties from being held liable for any issues that arise from information shared by a third party. This clause is used to protect parties from being responsible for information that they did not create or endorse. The policies had hefty premiums. Margaret had paid for them. And, of course, she was the beneficiary. How much was the payout? A few million, perhaps. What a windfall. With Tony dead, Margaret's net worth could double overnight. What a good man. Thinking about it, Margaret couldn't help but share Josh's sentiment. There were so many good people in this world. Her hatred for Tony Windus completely vanished. As a gesture of gratitude, she decided to give him an elaborate funeral. After all, with all those millions, it wouldn't be fair to skimp. Morning came quickly. As Josh had predicted, Margaret was enjoying her morning tea around 8 a.m. when the police arrived. Leading them was none other than Lieutenant Dietrich, who had handled Josh's earlier case. Although Tony had died outside Dietrich's jurisdiction, the victim lived within it. And yes, there was no doubt. Tony Windus was dead, dead. He'd been discovered by a passerby about 5 a.m. Due to the low temperatures, his body had already begun to stiffen. The police found numerous bruises on Tony's body, evidence of a severe beating. But the cause of death was a severe blow to the back of the head. "Good morning, Lieutenant. What brings you in so early?" Margaret asked as she ordered a servant to prepare coffee. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, Mrs. Wendis, but I regret to inform you that your husband has passed away," Dietrich said. "What? My husband is dead? What happened?" Margaret feigned surprise and showed no sign of grief, for she was not grieving. Pretending to be sad would have been unnecessary, even suspicious, since the police would easily discover the couple's strained relationship. "Mrs. Windus, your relationship with Mr. Windus seems to have been less than harmonious," Dietrich inquired. What reason could there be for an unemployed husband to stay out all night?" Margaret replied calmly. Dietrich suddenly felt he'd asked a silly question. According to the investigation, Tony had spent the night before his death in a questionable establishment. To neglect a beautiful, youthful wife like Margaret, to frequent such places. No one would believe that the couple had a happy marriage. As Josh had expected, Dietrich had no suspicion on Margaret. The crime scene clearly indicated that Tony Windus had been beaten to death after a drunken car accident. Several suspects were involved. Moreover, evidence at the scene, including the damaged car, had already led the police to link the case to a notorious gang of jewel thieves. None other than the four suited men Josh had seen. Coincidentally, this gang wasn't just dirty, they were linked to several robberies and a murder in the past few months. And the officer in charge of the case, Lieutenant Dietrich. To Josh and Margaret, this was just another group of good people. In fact, there were so many good people. Chapter 28. Joy for one, misery for another. Tony Windus's funeral was held 3 days after his death, at the renowned Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago's northern suburbs. Although Tony didn't have many close relatives, the funeral was well attended. As a former tennis star, albeit a second-rate one, he still had a certain level of recognition. However, Josh didn't join the crowd. Others might not know the truth, but he was fully aware of how Tony had met his end. Pretending to mourn someone you had a hand in killing felt too hypocritical. Instead, Josh stayed in a parked car at a distance, playing the role of Margaret's driver. After more than 2 hours of mingling and seeing off guests, Margaret finally returned to the car and got into the backseat. "How are you feeling? Tired?" Josh asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Margaret, dressed in a conservative black dress, wore a small veiled hat adorned with a black ribbon. A delicate pearl choker graced her neck, and sheer black stockings completed her ensemble. Her appearance was refined and elegant, exuding an air of mystery. "I'm fine. Everything was handled by the pastor and the funeral home. All I did was show up, so there wasn't much to tire me out," Margaret replied, shaking her head lightly. "By the way, what's with that guy?" Josh asked, nodding toward a young man lingering nearby, stealing glances in their direction. The man had also attended the funeral and had been trying to get close to Margaret since the beginning of the service. Josh had noticed him before. He had first seen the man when Joe Barbaro was tailing Margaret to a jewelry company. The man, David Liebler, appeared to be connected to the Uncle John Margaret had mentioned and had been openly flirting with her that day as well. Him. That's David Liebler, Uncle John's second son. He's a notorious playboy. He used to manage their family's business in New York but returned recently. When we ran into each other at Uncle John's office a while back, he found out I was preparing for a divorce and wouldn't stop pestering me. I thought I made it clear last time, but he still hasn't given up, Margaret said, frowning in irritation. Margaret genuinely disliked David, seeing him as no better than her late husband. Despite being in his early 30s, David had already been divorced twice, both times due to his womanizing and reckless lifestyle. If Tony had been somewhat discreet because of his public image as an athlete, David was shamelessly indulgent, flaunting his flings without care. With Tony serving as experience, Margaret had no interest in entertaining someone like David. "Want me to teach him a lesson?" Josh offered, narrowing his eyes. It was bad enough that Margaret had just become his golden ticket, and now someone was already trying to poach her. Josh could barely contain his anger. Maybe he should send David to keep Tony company. Forget it. Just stay away from him. Uncle John has been good to me, and I don't want to strain that relationship, Margaret replied quickly, halting Josh's dangerous thoughts. Margaret had come to understand that beneath Josh's seemingly harmless exterior lay a dangerous, wolfish nature. Yet this bad boy charm only deepened her infatuation with him. Even so, she didn't want Josh handling David. While she didn't care about Tony's fate, she did care about Uncle John. She couldn't bear the thought of the kind old man suffering the loss of his son because of her. Josh, though annoyed, respected Margaret's wishes and started the car, driving away from the cemetery. Out of sight, out of mind. As a time traveler, Josh hadn't felt much connection to this era. But with Margaret, a woman who had wholeheartedly devoted herself to him, his perspective had shifted. Others might not matter to him, but Margaret's emotions did. Rather than returning to the estate Margaret had once shared with Tony, they went back to their home in Evanston. The estate no longer held any sentimental value for Margaret. In fact, it reminded her of everything she despised about Tony. She had moved to Evanston with Josh, bringing along a few loyal servants. Their house in Evanston was spacious, boasting 8 bedrooms, more than enough for everyone. When they arrived, Margaret greeted their neighbors, Tommy's family, who were enjoying afternoon tea in their yard. Once inside, Josh wasted no time pulling Margaret into his arms. Wait, let me change first. Margaret protested playfully, swatting his wandering hands away. No need. I love you in this outfit, Josh murmured, holding her firmly and leaning close to her ear. Feeling his warm breath on her neck, Margaret melted into his embrace. With no further resistance, Josh scooped her up effortlessly, carrying her upstairs amid her surprised squeals. Moments later, her soft murmurs filled the house. Downstairs, the staff heard the sounds and couldn't help but smile, thinking, "Ah, youth is a beautiful thing." But while Margaret and Josh celebrated their new life together, in another corner of the city, a very different scene unfolded. Inside a dimly lit tavern, a group of 4 men sat in dejected silence. They were the same criminals who had planned to rob a jewelry store, only for their plans to be derailed by Tony Windus's drunken interference. Now, they had an unexpected murder charge hanging over their heads. It was hard to imagine anyone in their shoes feeling the least bit cheerful. Chapter 29. The quiet of night. The stir of souls out in the western suburbs of Chicago. Inside a small bar with a closed sign hanging outside, the interior was filled with smoke and gloom. A bartender and 4 men in suits were quietly drinking, their cigarettes adding to the haze. Who knew that drunk bastard would be so fragile? Now look at us. Not only did he die on us, but he also ruined our plans and made the cops tighten their grip. Damn it. Goss, pour me another, one of the suited men cursed, slamming his empty whiskey glass onto the counter. These 4 men were the unlucky group whose heist at the jewelry store had been derailed by Tony Windus's drunken intrusion. Unbeknownst to them, Tony's death was actually caused by Josh finishing the job later. The group genuinely believed they had accidentally beaten him to death that night. You've already drunk 2 bottles of my good stuff. Do you even know how rare real Kentucky bourbon is these days? Goss, the bartender and owner of the bar, retorted irritably. Besides running the bar, Goss also handled logistics for the group, securing weapons, cars, and fences for their loot. 2 bottles. Come on, Goss, it's just whiskey. The man snapped, clearly annoyed. Just whiskey. You've got some nerve saying that. Take a look around, Cody. It's not like 2 years ago anymore. A bottle of this stuff goes for $200 now, if you can even find one. Goss grumbled, pouring another glass for himself. Though prohibition had long ended, the war had driven alcohol prices sky high again. Official whiskey distilleries were barely producing for civilians, as most supplies were requisitioned by the military. A single bottle of legitimate bourbon could fetch a fortune, with black market prices starting at $200. Of course, cheaper options existed. Moonshine from makeshift distilleries could go for as little as $10 a bottle. But the quality was questionable, and the risk of poisoning was ever present. Who cares? We made a killing last time, didn't we? Cody argued, shrugging off Goss's complaints. For someone in their line of work, Living large was part of the deal. Made a killing. Really? Sure, you hit a couple of jewelry stores, but let's be honest. How much of it was actually worth anything? Even the gold was just 18-karat junk. You barely got any platinum, and most of the stuff was silver. Altogether, the haul might be worth 10 grand tops. And even if you could sell it all, you'd be lucky to pocket 2 grand each after cuts. Goss shot back, his frustration spilling out. The truth was, the team had been targeting low-tier jewelry stores that only stocked entry-level goods. Their loot, while plentiful, lacked real value. Even after fencing the goods, they were left with scraps compared to their expectations. Cody fell silent, clearly aware that Goss's assessment was spot on. All right, fine. Goss, crack open another bottle. It's on me. Lewis, the de facto leader of the group, interjected. Goss raised an eyebrow but complied, pulling out another of his dwindling bourbon reserves. Thanks, boss. Cody grinned, eagerly pouring drinks for everyone, himself included. This stuff won't last forever. Soon enough, I'll be stuck selling bathtub gin, Goss muttered. Don't worry, Goss. Things will turn around, Lewis assured him, raising his glass. Then he turned to his crew. Frank, Dix, stay sharp. Once the heat dies down, we'll hit something bigger. I'm with you, Lewis, grunted Dix, the largest and quietest of the group. But Frank, the youngest member, hesitated. After a moment, he spoke softly. I think I'm done, Lewis. I want out. The bar fell silent. Done. Why? Cody blurted out, his voice laced with irritation. You're just gonna quit because of a little heat. You're betraying us. Cody, shut it. Lewis snapped before turning to Frank. What's going on, kid? It's Marcy. She doesn't want me mixed up in this anymore, Frank admitted hesitantly, referring to his childhood sweetheart. Marcy. Again with her. Why let some farm girl tell you what to do? Look at Vanna. She knows better than to meddle in my business. Cody scoffed. Cody. Lewis shouted, silencing him. All right, Frank. If that's what you've decided, I won't stop you. But you know the rules. First, you forfeit half your cut. Second, if you ever sell us out, there will be consequences, Lewis said firmly, though his tone was understanding. Understood. Thank you, Lewis, Frank said gratefully. Just then, a knock came at the door. Everyone froze, their hands inching toward concealed weapons. Goss gestured for calm and peered through the peephole. After a moment, he relaxed. It's Corby, he announced. Hearing the name, the tension in the room eased. Corby was a well-known fixer in the area, a middleman for jobs, fencing, loans, and underground gambling. Corby stepped inside, glancing around. Lewis, someone wants to meet you, he said directly without beating around the bush. Who? Lewis asked, narrowing his eyes. Dr. Schneider. Erwin Lyndon Schneider. Ever heard of him? Corby replied. Lewis's eyes widened. Schneider. The Schneider from Philly. The room fell silent once more, but this time, the tension was different. A name like Schneider carried weight, and whatever he wanted, it was bound to be big. Chapter 30. A new idea for the deal. Josh neither knew nor cared about the unfortunate situation of those good men who had taken the fall for him. As long as his own life was going well, that was all that mattered. Each day he would sleep in until late in the morning, then spend his free time with Margaret, riding horses on a country farm, basking in the sun, or enjoying pastimes like golf or bowling. Occasionally, they would take a boat ride on Lake Michigan, see a play or a movie at the theater. They seemed like a honeymooning couple, completely inseparable because of their rich and varied entertainment. But in the midst of spending so much time with Margaret, Josh didn't neglect his business, his interdimensional smuggling operation with Daenerys. Though he spent most of his days glued to Margaret's side, he still found time here and there to visit Chicago's various gun shops, bookstores, and black markets to acquire items Daenerys had requested. Every night at 7 p.m., regardless of his other activities, Josh would lock himself in his study for about half an hour to stay in touch with Daenerys and maintain their partnership. Margaret, though a bit curious about Josh's peculiar habit of locking himself away every night, never poked her head into it. She understood the importance of giving her partner personal space. In addition, Josh still maintained his lifestyle from his previous life. No smoking, no excessive drinking, no gambling, and no visits to questionable establishments, not that he had the opportunity. To Margaret, a man with such healthy habits was a rare treasure. She adored him and didn't see his occasional aloofness as a flaw, quite the opposite. In fact, she found his protectiveness quite charming. With so many positives, why fuss over such a small, inconsequential issue? That night at 7 p.m., Josh greeted Daenerys through the screen. She was dressed in an elegant, court-style gown. "I have some new items for you, Daenerys," Josh said. The gown Josh had sent her as a gift was an Elizabethan-style masterpiece, one Josh had commissioned at great expense. To be clear, this was Queen Elizabeth I, not the future monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. After all, in 1943, the reigning British monarch was the stuttering King George VI, while the future queen was just an 18-year-old princess. Daenerys' current attire, while considered luxurious in her world, would seem modest by 20th-century American standards or even by the grandeur of 15th and 16th-century European aristocratic fashion. Still, the dress had captured Daenerys' heart. After all, no woman can resist looking beautiful, especially a queen who must maintain her regal presence in public. "What is it this time?" Daenerys asked curiously. "This," Josh replied as he initiated a transaction. After confirming the exchange, Daenerys discovered a collection of exquisite jewelry and tableware. Her eyes lit up as she examined the items, much like the dress Josh had sent her earlier. The craftsmanship of the jewelry and tableware was breathtaking. Though Daenerys was no stranger to wealth, the artistry behind these items left her speechless. In terms of sheer wealth, Josh couldn't compare to Daenerys, her treasury far exceeded his. But wealth of raw materials isn't everything. Craftsmanship can transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. The pieces Josh sent featured intricate designs and delicate details, a stark contrast to the more crude styles of Westerosi jewelry. While handcrafted pieces have a unique charm, technological advances greatly enhance the result. For example, diamonds, though abundant, were difficult to cut properly in pre-modern times due to their hardness and brittleness. One false move and a large, valuable diamond could shatter. Then there were materials like aluminum. In modern times, it's common and inexpensive. But in Daenerys' world, where there were no mining processes, aluminum was practically unheard of as a mythical metal. Josh had sent her a set of aluminum jewelry set with small diamonds, along with aluminum tableware. These items, worth little in 20th century America, would be considered priceless treasures in Daenerys' world, worthy of any royal collection. Such exquisite jewelry. "What is this material? I thought it was silver at first, but it's so light," Daenerys exclaimed as she admired the pieces. "It's aluminum," Josh explained. "In my world, it's an abundant metal, but its extraction requires special techniques. In your world, producing even small amounts would be nearly impossible, unless your dragons could help, but even then the yield would be minimal." Daenerys quickly understood the implications. "Interesting. I see what you're getting at," she said with a smile. "That's a very intriguing idea, Josh. But tell me, is there nothing else you're after besides gold? At this rate, you're going to empty my treasury of all its gold." Josh chuckled. "Your Majesty, I'm sure your treasury is far from empty, especially with the items I'm providing. But speaking of which, I have a new idea for our transactions." "Let's hear it," Daenerys replied. "Raw materials," Josh said. Chapter 31. The pink diamond in the bedroom. Margaret, dressed casually in a silk robe, was leaning against the bed's headboard, absorbed in a book. Margaret wasn't exactly a literature freak, so the book she was reading wasn't some profound essay or poetry collection, but rather an ordinary, popular novel. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice that Josh had spent a little longer than usual in the study that evening. It wasn't until Josh opened the door that she looked up, startled. However, she immediately saw Josh carefully closing and locking the door before mysteriously approaching the window. "What's going on, honey?" Margaret asked curiously. "Nothing much. I just came by to give you a gift," Josh said, feigning mystery. "A gift? Let me guess. Jewelry?" Margaret said with surprise, followed by excitement. "Oh dear, you guessed right," Josh exclaimed, genuinely surprised at how accurate her guess was. "Is it really jewelry? That's wonderful. Let me see," Margaret said, excited and full of anticipation. Josh could tell, however, that while Margaret was genuinely excited, her level of anticipation wasn't particularly high. This was understandable. As a wealthy woman whose father had once been a major jeweler, Margaret had seen and handled countless pieces of high-end jewelry. Aside from the large diamond ring she had already put away, Josh had seen her other jewelry, each a collectible masterpiece. So it was unrealistic to expect her to be overly enthusiastic about typical jewelry. That was also why, despite knowing Margaret for so long and becoming so close, Josh had rarely given her a formal gift. He simply didn't have anything impressive enough. On the other hand, Margaret showered Josh with gifts all the time. From cars to houses, from clothes to accessories. She even seemed willing to give Josh her vast fortune all at once. There was a natural disparity in their initial financial positions. So Margaret's anticipation was less about the value of the gift and more about it being Josh's first formal gift to her. Realizing this, Josh felt even more indebted to her and found himself appreciating this woman even more. As it turned out, Margaret's assumptions were wrong today. The jewelry Josh was about to present to her was, in fact, far more precious than she could have imagined. Not just precious. Absolutely unique in the world. Without deliberately heightening Margaret's curiosity for fear of overwhelming her, Josh simply reached into his coat and pulled out the gift. The moment Josh revealed it, Margaret froze. Her eyes widened as she clasped her hands tightly over her mouth, her gaze fixed on the dazzling brilliance of the crystal under the dim table lamp. The gift Josh was presenting was both ordinary and extraordinary. It was ordinary in that it was a diamond. Thanks to her upbringing and her father's jewelry business, Margaret quickly recognized it as a real diamond, an incredibly rare pink diamond, no less. But an ordinary pink diamond wasn't enough to leave Margaret speechless. What really shocked her was the extraordinary size of this diamond. Pigeon egg was often used as a term for large diamonds, but had she ever seen one the size of a chicken egg? And a pink one at that. Until today, the largest diamond Margaret knew of was the famous Cullinan diamond, discovered in South Africa in 1905 and presented to the British royal family. How big was it? About the size of an adult woman's palm. It was 10 centimeters long, 6.5 centimeters wide, and 5 centimeters high, and weighed 3,106 carats. It was transparent with a faint blue tint and was graded Florida, flawless, the highest grade. However, in 1908, this diamond had been cut into 9 large pieces and 96 smaller ones. In comparison, the diamond before Margaret was smaller, but still amazing. It was much larger than the second largest Koh-i-Noor, with a slightly lower clarity rating of if internally flawless, the second highest grade, but weighed well over 1,000 carats. And it was a pink diamond. A pink diamond. A pink diamond. Important things are worth repeating. Let's not dismiss diamonds as a scam. In the 21st century, diamonds have become something of a scam due to their abundance and the rise of synthetic diamonds. But in 1943, things were different. Although diamonds were abundant around the world, only a fraction, those of gem quality, were considered valuable. Within that fraction, diamonds that met the highest 4C standards, carat, clarity, color, cut, were extremely rare. This rarity justified their value in the marketplace. Synthetic diamonds didn't become a factor until the 1970s, and even then, gem-quality synthetic diamonds didn't appear until around 2000. In this era, the diamond Josh held in his hand was a real, unique treasure. Is this really for me? Where did you get it? Does anyone else know about it? Margaret asked in a soft, trembling voice. Despite her excitement, Margaret couldn't ignore the implications. The value of such a treasure was the least of her worries. The real danger was that its existence would become known. Margaret feared that she and Josh might one day meet a tragic end because of it. Such a treasure could cause a worldwide frenzy. Without the power of the pre-World War I British Empire, no one could protect it. Even the British royal family had chosen to cut the Cullinan diamond, not because they didn't know that bigger was better, but because they feared it would attract too much attention. Margaret wasn't sure if Josh was showing her his deep love or setting her up for trouble. Fortunately, there was a way to mitigate the risk. As the British royal family had done, the diamond could be cut. And that was exactly what Josh had in mind when he gave the diamond to Margaret. She had learned to cut diamonds from her jeweler father, though she had only ever worked with smaller stones. Chapter 32. The idea of starting a factory. Fructose. My dear, I understand your concerns. Rest assured, as long as you don't reveal anything, the existence of this diamond will remain known only to the two of us. Josh explained with a reassuring smile in response to Margaret's worries. After all, this gem had been sitting in the treasure vault of the Dragon Queen, Daenerys, in another world just 10 minutes ago. There was no way anyone in this world could have seen it before. The aluminum jewelry and finely cut diamond pieces Josh had previously gifted to Daenerys had inspired her with a lucrative new business venture. In return, she provided Josh with a vast collection of jewels, primarily raw diamonds. As on Earth, diamonds were classified as gemstones in Westeros but weren't particularly popular. The reason wasn't their abundance but the sheer difficulty of polishing diamonds with ancient technology. It made mass production impossible, though diamonds were easily used for cutting metals. However, this pink diamond had not initially been part of Daenerys' trade offerings. Such an exceptional stone, despite its challenging craftsmanship, was among the finest treasures in Westeros. Its soft pink hue was one of Daenerys' favorites, so it had been locked away in her private vault of prized possessions. But Daenerys had made the mistake of promising Josh he could choose one item from her vault. And that was that. By now, Daenerys was probably sulking in a corner of her palace, drawing angry circles on the floor. Are you sure? Margaret's doubt only deepened at Josh's explanation. How could such a priceless diamond exist with only the two of them knowing about it? Trust me, nothing will happen. Look at how perfectly it suits you, Josh said, holding the diamond against Margaret's ample chest. At that moment, Josh's eyes were glued to the sight. The pink diamond, glowing under the dim yellow bedside lamp, cast a radiant glow on Margaret's fair skin, creating a scene of unparalleled beauty. Margaret, startled by Josh's sudden and fiery gaze, barely had time to let out a small cry before being pushed down onto the bed. Diamond. To hell with the diamond. As the mattress springs endured the strain of their movements, the once admired pink diamond was gradually pushed closer to the edge of the bed by the bouncing. Finally, with a soft thud, it fell to the floor, landing safely on the wooden planks below. It was fortunate the floor was wood. Had it been tiled, this precious gem might have met its untimely demise less than 30 minutes after arriving in this world. You want to start a sugar factory, an aluminum alloy plant, and a craft goods company? Margaret asked as she toyed with the diamond in her hands, still basking in the afterglow of their recent activities. The alloy plant and craft goods factory seem doable, but a sugar factory? Isn't it hard to source raw materials these days? Margaret didn't object to Josh's business plans in the slightest. After all, the factories he wanted to set up weren't large scale and wouldn't require much money, likely just tens of thousands. That was a drop in the bucket for Margaret, who had recently received a substantial insurance payout following Tony Wenda's death. In fact, if Josh wanted more money, she'd gladly provide it. Even if he lost every cent, she wouldn't mind. Especially after receiving the diamond Josh had just gifted her. Even if it were cut into smaller pieces and sold, its value would far exceed her current net worth. But, as she had pointed out, the sugar factory posed a problem. Starting an aluminum alloy plant or a craft goods factory was relatively straightforward. Despite wartime economic conditions, aluminum, a key material for aviation, was not entirely restricted in the US because the country imported most of its bauxite from Brazil, which was unaffected by the war. While aluminum products were rationed, raw materials were not, and the government would even encourage such production. Any output would likely be purchased by the military, ensuring no losses. The craft goods factory, focusing on items like glassware and inexpensive diamond crafts, wasn't tied to the war effort and posed no issues. The sugar factory, however, was a different story. At this time, sugar production primarily relied on sugarcane and sugar beets. Corn syrup and fructose, though known, had limited production due to underdeveloped technology, making them more expensive than regular sugar. Additionally, sugarcane and sugar beets were seasonal crops. With Pacific trade routes disrupted by the war, Southeast Asian sugarcane imports had stopped. Domestic supplies were allocated to large companies, leaving smaller factories like Josh's without raw materials unless he had connections. What Margaret didn't know was that Josh never intended to source raw materials from this world. His supply would come from Westeros. Daenerys' interest in sugar wasn't because Westeros lacked it entirely but because the continent didn't have refined sugar production technology. Josh could import raw sugar from Westeros, refine it here, and sell it back to Daenerys, or on the domestic market, for enormous profits. This plan wasn't without risks. If the US government discovered the anomaly of producing large quantities of sugar without raw materials, questions would arise. But Josh's ultimate goal wasn't even traditional sugar. He was focused on introducing something revolutionary for the era: high fructose corn syrup. Have you heard of fructose? What if I told you I had a way to extract sugar sweeter than cane sugar and cheaper to produce, from cornstarch? Josh asked, his voice filled with intrigue as he addressed Margaret's doubts. Chapter 33. The charity Galath's so-called high fructose corn syrup is nothing more than the fructose-glucose syrup widely used in modern food processing, gradually replacing cane sugar in many applications. This type of sugar only became commercially available after the 1950s, but its production process is not overly complex. The most crucial components are two enzymes, amylase and glucose isomerase. The former had already been extracted by the 1930s, though it had not yet been commercialized. The latter, however, would not be discovered until the 1950s. For Josh, only the first enzyme is necessary. Its primary function is to hydrolyze starch into glucose syrup. The second enzyme's role, converting glucose into fructose to enhance sweetness, is not immediately essential. Josh's knowledge of these enzymes stemmed from a certain unfortunate drinking buddy before his transmigration. That friend worked in the raw material supply chain for fast-moving consumer goods, essentially a supplier for boba tea shops. Back when his friend was starting his business, Josh had often lent a hand during his free time, which gave him some insights into the industry. However, Josh himself was no biologist. He couldn't produce amylase or manufacture fructose syrup on his own. Fortunately, he didn't need to. He could outsource that work. Chicago, being the educational hub of the Midwest, boasts 19 universities, including prestigious institutions like the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, and the University of Illinois. There is also a wealth of research institutes. Finding a few specialists in the field wouldn't be difficult. If you're confident, go ahead and do it. Just tell me how much money you need, Margaret said after hearing Josh's plan. But since you're starting a business, you'll need to network with some influential people. It just so happens that I received an invitation to a gala this weekend. It's from Uncle John, who's hosting the event. I hadn't planned on attending, but given your new venture, we should go together. I'll introduce you to some people who could be helpful for your business. Despite the time Josh and Margaret had spent together, she had yet to bring him to any high society events. It wasn't because Josh wasn't presentable. In fact, after her father's death, Margaret had largely withdrawn from attending such gatherings. Initially, it was because people constantly whispered about Tony Windus's scandals around her, which led to arguments with former friends. Later, when she learned those rumors were true, she avoided such events altogether, fearing humiliation. Coupled with her recent struggles with David Liebler's harassment, she had even less interest in socializing. So, the topic of attending galas had never come up. Until now. However, if Josh wanted to start a factory and establish a business, networking was essential. This gala became a necessary occasion. What kind of gala is it? Josh asked. It's a war bond charity gala hosted by the city government, with Uncle John as the lead organizer. Influential figures from all over Chicago will be attending, Margaret explained. Josh nodded. This was indeed an event worth attending. Will it cause you any trouble? He asked. This would be his first high-profile event in either of his lifetimes. What trouble could there be? Besides, it's a good opportunity to show everyone I'm doing just fine, Margaret replied with a gentle smile. Is there anything I should keep in mind? Josh asked. Just dress handsomely. Soon, the weekend arrived. Dressed impeccably, Josh and Margaret arrived punctually at the venue, a lavish estate owned by the Liebler family. By the time they arrived, the estate was already bustling. The courtyard was filled with high-end cars from this era. Compared to these, the wine-red Lincoln Continental Josh had driven that day appeared modest. If he were to take out the Cadillac V16 from his system inventory, it would undoubtedly turn heads. But now wasn't the time. Although Josh had managed to enter Chicago's upper-class society by being with Margaret, this was far from a guarantee of security. After all, when push comes to shove, desperate people fear nothing. The Italian mobsters were known for their ruthlessness. They had even plotted to assassinate a president before. Until Josh had sufficient means to protect himself, the Cadillac would remain a personal collector's item. Thankfully, the system space preserved items in a timeless state, so there was no risk of the car deteriorating from neglect. After handing over the invitation to the attendant, Margaret and Josh entered the grand hall without issue. Margaret, long time no see, called a familiar voice shortly after their arrival. It belonged to an elegant lady about Margaret's age. Gloria, it's been so long. Margaret warmly greeted her friend with an air kiss. The two seemed quite close. Margaret offered Josh an apologetic smile as Gloria pulled her aside to chat in private. Unable to join their conversation, Josh surveyed the surroundings to ease his awkwardness. He grabbed a glass of wine from a passing waiter's tray. While Josh wasn't fond of drinking, he wasn't a complete teetotaler. He had tested his current body's tolerance before and found it passable. What's your name? A refined-looking middle-aged man approached him. Josh. Josh Kahn, he replied politely. Patrick Chase. Gloria's my wife. The man introduced himself, gesturing toward the two women. Josh nodded in understanding. That explained why Patrick had approached him. The two struck up a casual conversation. Given that they were unfamiliar with each other, their discussion avoided anything too personal, quickly turning to the war. A popular topic for men at such events, especially at a war bond charity gala. As they talked, Josh's observations about the ongoing conflict impressed Patrick. A former logistics officer during World War I, Patrick now owned a department store in Chicago. He wasn't a stranger to military matters, and Josh's insights into the war's trajectory were refreshingly novel. Josh, with your knowledge, it's a shame you're not in the military, making a name for yourself. Patrick remarked. Josh resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Join the army. With this body, barely a ninth-grade dropout, what could he do besides carry ammunition on the front lines? In World War II, while the military rapidly expanded, officer roles weren't handed out to just anyone. Specialized branches like the Air Force or Navy still required a high school diploma at minimum. Even if he qualified, Josh had no intention of risking his life for a soulless government. Why bother when he could comfortably enjoy his life with a wealthy partner? Mr. Chase, Josh isn't even 16 yet. He's far from the legal age to enlist. Margaret interjected as she returned, slipping her arm through Josh's and glaring disapprovingly at Patrick. Patrick froze in surprise. He took another look at Josh, noting his youthful features, which he had overlooked earlier due to Josh's height, composed demeanor, and sharp insights. 16. Patrick glanced back and forth between Josh and the mature, striking Margaret. Well, in fairness, such relationships weren't unheard of among the upper classes of this era. Had it been the 21st century, Margaret might have faced legal charges. Chapter 34. Taking a big gamble after temporarily parting ways with the Chase couple, Margaret led Josh to meet one of the hosts of the evening's event, John Liebler. Good evening, my dear. I'm so glad you could make it. You're as stunning as ever, said the seemingly kind older gentleman, greeting Margaret warmly with a gentle hug. Standing beside him were two men. One was David, whom Josh had encountered before. He was glaring at Josh with visible displeasure. The other man was an older gentleman, likely close in age to John Liebler. Thank you, Uncle John. By the way, let me introduce Josh to you, the one I mentioned before. Margaret smiled as she gestured toward Josh. Good evening, Mr. Liebler. I'm Josh Kahn. It's a pleasure to meet you, Josh said respectfully, maintaining his composure. A fine young man. Enjoy yourself, John said, giving Josh a brief, appraising look before nodding in approval and extending his hand. The gesture was a clear sign of initial acceptance, though mostly out of consideration for Margaret, who was a close family friend. Josh, understanding the importance of this moment, extended his hand and shook John's firmly, expressing his respect. Oh, and let me introduce you to Alonzo Emery, my longtime legal associate, John said, gesturing toward the older man beside him. As for David, John had no intention of introducing him. He understood his son's nature all too well. While he wouldn't mind if Margaret and David had shown mutual interest, it was evident Margaret wasn't interested in David at all. There was no point in forcing the matter or embarrassing anyone, especially not as the host of this prestigious event. David, though unhappy, wasn't foolish enough to cause a scene. Even his hostile glares at Josh remained silent. Nice to meet you, young man. If you ever have any legal issues, feel free to reach out to me, Alonzo Emery said warmly. Unlike John's casual attitude, Alonzo was much more enthusiastic. Lawyers in the U.S. held prestigious positions, but ultimately, they served wealthy clients. Margaret was a significant client of his, especially since she had recently received a substantial insurance payout, a case Alonzo himself had managed. After a brief conversation and exchanging business cards with Alonzo, Josh and Margaret moved on. At events like this, the main purpose was to meet new people and exchange contact information. Any serious discussions would happen elsewhere. Margaret guided Josh around, introducing him to various prominent figures in Chicago's business and political circles. As the evening progressed, the event reached its main focus: fundraising speeches. Since it was a war bond fundraising gala, fiery speeches from politicians were an essential part of the program. The main speakers included Chicago's mayor, a Democratic senator from Illinois, and a military representative. Josh, do you think we'll win this war? Margaret asked, glancing at the senator delivering a passionate speech. Of course. The United States will undoubtedly emerge victorious, Josh said confidently, his knowledge of history giving him certainty. Although Josh suspected this world might be a parallel timeline, the overall trajectory of major historical events seemed intact. Unless this was an alternate reality like the man in the high castle. But even then, Josh wouldn't worry much. After all, he was of Austrian descent, a peculiar advantage in wartime. In the Axis powers, Austrians were closely aligned with Germans due to shared culture and language. Meanwhile, in the US, Austrians were considered victims of invasion and faced far less scrutiny than German Americans. How much should we contribute to the war bonds? Margaret asked, her confidence bolstered by Josh's certainty. As much as possible, if you can afford it, Josh replied after a moment's thought, leaning closer to Margaret. His advice was deliberate. At this time, war bonds were one of the safest and most lucrative investments. The profit margin was a staggering 100%, depending on how the bonds were handled. During World War II, U.S. war bonds were sold at 75% or 50% of their face value and matured after 10 years. For example, a $100 bond could be purchased for $50, and after 10 years, it would be redeemable for the full $100. With a low inflation rate guaranteed by America's massive gold reserves and the Bretton Woods system, these bonds were a foolproof investment. Do you really think it's worth going all in? Margaret asked skeptically. Are you considering making a big move? Josh asked, noticing her intrigued expression. I'm thinking we should go big, Margaret replied. Josh immediately understood what she meant. Just like modern charity galas, these war bond events had a competitive edge. The person who donated the most, or purchased the highest amount of bonds, would undoubtedly attract attention from high-ranking officials and elites. For Margaret, this could be a golden opportunity to establish connections and elevate her social standing. While it wasn't realistic for her to outspend America's wealthiest elites, she could aim to be the top donor at this specific event. Do you think $3 million would be enough? Margaret asked thoughtfully. Josh nodded after considering it. The U.S. government issued war bonds in multiple rounds during the war. Even the wealthiest businessmen couldn't invest millions in every round. They had businesses to run. $3 million would likely secure Margaret's spot as the top donor of this gala without straining her finances. However, as the gala concluded and the senator announced the top donor, Josh was stunned. Josh Kahn. $3 million. The crowd erupted in applause, leaving Josh completely speechless. Chapter 35. Sabrina. As expected by Margaret and Josh, the purchase of $3 million in war bonds claimed the top spot for the evening. Because of this, Josh, who had initially been a mere background figure, became the center of attention at the gala. Guests flocked to engage with him, and even individuals like John Liebler, the mayor, and the senator, who had previously not paid much attention to him, made their way over. Those aware of Josh's relationship with Margaret began to view him in a new light. Initially, many assumed Josh to be nothing more than Margaret's kept lover. But to their surprise, it turned out he was a big fish in his own right, or so they believed. Aside from Margaret, Josh, and the bank representative collecting the checks, no one knew that the funds were actually Margaret's contribution. Most of the attendees would never have guessed that Margaret, of all people, would spend such an enormous sum for a mere lover. After all, It wasn't $30,000 or $300,000, it was $3 million. For many attendees, that sum exceeded their total net worth. Even someone as familiar with Margaret as John Liebler found it hard to believe. Margaret, you didn't have to go this far, Josh whispered to her, finally free from the endless stream of guests. But isn't this the best outcome? Margaret smiled warmly. I don't run a business, so this title doesn't mean much to me. But it's different for you. After tonight, your name will be known throughout Chicago, and perhaps even across many parts of the country. This will greatly benefit you in setting up factories and businesses. If you ever decide to enter politics, this will be a valuable asset. Looking at Margaret's thoughtfulness, Josh felt deeply moved. However, at that moment, some commotion arose in the venue. Josh and Margaret noticed John Liebler leaving the gala in a hurry, accompanied by a group of people. This unusual exit sparked a wave of whispers among the guests. Though the gala's central figures were the mayor, the senator, and the military representative from the fundraising organization, as the host, John Liebler leaving early was strange. Excuse me, but do you know what's going on? Margaret asked a waiter. Sorry, ma'am, I don't know either, the waiter replied with a shake of his head. Sensing the odd atmosphere, someone from the fundraising organization quickly stepped in to calm the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Liebler had to attend to a personal matter and left early. There's no need to worry. Tonight's gala has been a great success, and we thank Mr. Josh Kahn and all of you for your contributions. Let's raise our glasses. As the situation settled, Josh noticed that Emery, the lawyer who had been with John Liebler earlier, also left the venue discreetly, his expression tense. Josh had no idea what was happening, but it didn't concern him. After staying for another half hour as guests gradually departed, Josh and Margaret also decided it was time to leave. Just as they stepped outside, a figure was about to collide with Margaret. Fortunately, Josh reacted quickly, stepping in front of her. The individual, who appeared small in stature, fell to the ground from the impact. Josh, on the other hand, was unharmed. The person quickly got up and began apologizing repeatedly. I'm sorry, sir. I'm very sorry. It was then that Josh and Margaret noticed the individual was a young woman dressed in a maid's uniform, likely one of the Liebler staff. Her head was bowed, obscuring her face, but she appeared to be around Josh's age. No problem. Are you hurt? Margaret asked kindly, her voice full of concern. Hearing Margaret's gentle tone, the maid finally looked up. Audrey Hepburn. Josh blurted out upon seeing her face. The maid's resemblance to the future Hollywood icon, Audrey Hepburn, was striking. However, the young woman appeared confused. Sir, are you speaking to me? My name isn't Audrey Hepburn, it's Sabrina Fairchild. You must have me mistaken for someone else. Josh froze in embarrassment. Mistaken identity. Wait. Suddenly, it dawned on Josh. If Margaret was a character from a movie, then perhaps this Audrey Hepburn lookalike could be from a film, too. Before Josh could think further, a sharp pain shot through his waist. He turned to see Margaret looking away, feigning innocence. So, all women know this trick. Josh thought wryly. Sorry, I must have made a mistake. Josh apologized to Sabrina. It's all right, sir. It's my fault for bumping into you both, Sabrina said, nervously adding, if it's okay, may I leave? I have something urgent to attend to. Of course, Josh replied, stepping aside. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am, Sabrina said before rushing into the hall. Who is Audrey Hepburn? Margaret asked as soon as Sabrina was out of earshot. What's the matter? Jealous? Josh teased. HMPH, why would I be jealous? You're not even mine, Margaret retorted. A few moments ago, she had been calling him dear, and now he was not hers. How quickly things change. Don't be mad. I'll explain, Josh said with a half-truth. She's a Dutch girl I met when my family was fleeing during the war. She's about my age, but after the war began, I lost contact with her. That girl earlier just looked a lot like her. This explanation seemed to soften Margaret's attitude. Sorry, darling. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories, she said, her tone now full of sympathy. With this, the small misunderstanding regarding Sabrina faded away. However, as Josh and Margaret made their way home, the sight of speeding police cars and road checkpoints made them uneasy. Officer, what's going on? Josh asked a policeman at a checkpoint, slipping him a $20 bill as a tip. Tempted by the money and reassured by Josh and Margaret's high-end car and attire, the policeman leaned in and whispered, "The Liebler Jewelry Company was robbed. Their vault was hit. Losses are estimated to be in the millions." Josh and Margaret exchanged shocked glances. No wonder John Liebler had left the gala early. As the police car lights flashed in the distance, an image of the nervous lawyer Emery sneaking out of the gala crossed Josh's mind. Chapter 36. The Great Heist. The next morning, after finishing breakfast, Josh sat in the living room, reading the newspaper. His expression was peculiar, a mix of emotions, leaving it unclear whether he was upset or pleased. "Darling, what's wrong?" Margaret walked over, kissed his cheek, and asked with a smile. "To be honest, I find it hard to believe that the person this paper describes is me." Josh replied helplessly, handing her the newspaper. It was a copy of the Chicago Tribune, one of the city's oldest publications and the third largest newspaper in the U.S. Margaret took the paper and couldn't help but laugh. The front page headline read, 3 million. Austrian aristocratic youth's anti-fascist resolve. The article detailed last night's charity gala, where Margaret, under Josh's name, purchased $3 million worth of war bonds. However, after some creative editorial flair, the report had taken an unusual turn. The article painted Josh and his late parents as a heroic noble family from Austria, persecuted for resisting fascism during Germany's invasion. It claimed they fled across the ocean to America, where they continued their struggle. After their untimely deaths, Josh supposedly inherited their legacy, dedicating his life to the cause by donating his fortune, a whopping $3 million, to support America's anti-fascist efforts. The passionate and vivid descriptions in the article left Josh feeling disoriented. When had he ever been so noble? And when had his family become aristocrats? Oh, wait. During an interview after the gala, he had mentioned that his grandfather, this body's grandfather, was a military officer in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had a minor noble title. But, come on. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed over 2 decades ago, and the Habsburg dynasty was long gone. That grandfather had even died during World War I. Apparently, the journalist had decided to elaborate this detail. Josh found it absurd, though he could understand it, given Americans' fascination with nobility. Of course, the real purpose of the article was to promote war bond sales. The underlying message was clear. Even a native of that guy's homeland is going all in to support the war. Shouldn't you, as an American citizen, do your part? This isn't bad at all. At least we achieved our goal. By the end of today, your name will be known throughout Chicago and even parts of the United States. That will be a great help for your future business ventures, Margaret said with a gentle laugh. And in my heart, you've always been the greatest. But this isn't fair to you. Josh sighed. He hadn't wanted this attention, but Margaret had been adamant. She even threatened to burn the bonds, worth a total of $6 million, if he dared reveal she was the one who paid for them. Faced with this kind of soft power, Josh had no choice but to relent. Do we really need to talk about fairness? If you feel indebted to me, then start your factories as soon as possible and build a successful business, Margaret said, giving him a warm hug. Her encouraging words reignited Josh's determination. Oh, my God, look at this. The Liebler family vault robbed. 1 guard injured, 1 thief shot, renowned crime expert Erwin Lynn Schneider suspected. So the police were telling the truth. John's family vault really was robbed. Margaret exclaimed as she turned to another page in the newspaper. Yeah, I saw that. But don't worry about your Uncle John. In cases like this, the insurance company is far more anxious than the victim, Josh replied casually. Under normal circumstances, this kind of heist would have made the front page. But during wartime, such news couldn't overshadow Josh's headline. The U.S. was in full swing, elevating war heroes and narratives to support the effort. However, Josh's point was valid. This was a commercial insurance vault, not a private family vault, meaning it was insured. The insurance company would undoubtedly be more concerned than the Lieblers. You're right. Insurance. That's such a relief, Margaret said, finally relaxing after Josh's reminder. By the way, what do you think of that lawyer, Emery? What kind of person is he? Josh suddenly asked. Lawyer Emery. Why bring him up? Margaret asked, puzzled. Well, he's one of the top legal experts in the city. I'll need a lot of legal support soon when I start my company, Josh replied, without mentioning his suspicions about Emery. In terms of expertise, Uncle John says he's among the best. But as a person, Margaret trailed off. What about him? Josh pressed, curious. I've heard his private life is a mess. He keeps a mistress young enough to be his granddaughter. I only know this because I hired a private investigator a while back, Margaret said quietly. Hearing this, Josh raised an eyebrow. Margaret's comment about the lawyer seemed like a subtle warning aimed at him. Honestly, Margaret was overthinking. With a stunning woman like her by his side, few could catch his eye. Still, as he thought that, Sabrina's face briefly flashed in his mind. Shaking his head, Josh dismissed the thought. Without a movie star aura, she wasn't particularly special. By the way, I have a meeting at McKinsey later. Want to come with me? Josh asked, changing the subject. McKinsey, in this case, was a management consulting firm, not related to the controversial McCarthyism of the 50s. Josh needed to build 3 factories, and he couldn't do it alone. He needed to hire professionals. Management consulting firms like McKinsey were already providing headhunting services in the 1930s. Last week, Josh had submitted his staffing requirements, and on Friday, McKinsey had sent over a list of candidates. Now it was time for Josh to interview them. I'll pass. I'm not interested in that. Besides, I've managed to get a set of equipment from Uncle John. It's arriving today, and I'll be busy cutting the pink heart diamond for a while, Margaret replied. The pink heart was the massive pink diamond Margaret planned to cut in private, given its immense value and sensitivity. Chapter 37. Lyndon Schneider. The interviews at McKinsey Consulting went exceptionally well. Josh successfully hired 5 qualified individuals. 3 experienced managers, 1 financial officer, and 1 administrative secretary. All 5 were men. This was normal for the pre-World War II era. Even in a progressive country like the United States, women's participation in the workforce was minimal and concentrated in fields considered suitable for women, such as teaching, clerical work, and retail services. It wasn't until the U.S. entered the war, when men enlisted in droves and labor shortages arose, that women were actively encouraged by the Roosevelt administration to fill roles across various industries. After the war ended, however, many women lost their jobs as returning male workers reclaimed their positions. This trend persisted until the 1960s when significant social change began to occur. Similarly, access to higher education for women was limited. While some public universities admitted women as early as the 19th century, these institutions were often community or vocational colleges, teaching basic career skills. Elite schools such as Harvard, Yale, and Caltech only started admitting women much later, typically in the 1970s. Even MIT, which began admitting women in 1911, maintained a very low enrollment rate for female students. Thus, finding well-educated female professionals in this era was rare unless they came from prominent families working for their own businesses. If Josh didn't want a mere decoration for his office, hiring men was the only option. After completing the interviews, Josh assigned tasks to his new team. The managers were to scout suitable factory locations, while the financial officer and secretary were tasked with finding a suitable office space. With the work delegated, Josh declined an invitation to a celebratory dinner with McKinsey executives and prepared to return home. As he exited the building, a fleet of police cars sped by, sirens blaring. Moments later, the distinct rattle of machine guns echoed from the direction of the Lakeside district. Josh hesitated but quickly decided to avoid trouble and head in the opposite direction. Staying out of it seemed the wisest course of action. However, as Murphy's Law dictates, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. While taking a detour along a quiet park road, a man suddenly appeared in front of his car. Josh instinctively slammed on the brakes. Since the road was narrow and his speed was low, he managed to avoid hitting the man. But when Josh got a better look, he immediately regretted stopping. The man was towering, likely over 6 feet 6 inches tall, and holding a gun aimed directly at Josh. Hey, buddy, don't do anything rash. Let's talk this out, Josh said, raising his hands in surrender. Inside, however, he was already planning to retrieve a shotgun from his system inventory as soon as he saw an opening. Apologies, sir, but we just need your car, the tall man said, motioning with the gun for Josh to step out. Well-mannered or not, Josh mentally labeled him a dead man walking. But wait. Did he say we? Before Josh could dwell on it, another figure emerged from the bushes. This one was an older gentleman in a sharp suit, carrying a black leather bag. He seemed dignified yet utterly out of place in this tense situation. Josh recognized him immediately, Lyndon Schneider. The man's face had been all over the morning papers in connection with the high-profile heist. Well, isn't this just my lucky day? Josh thought sarcastically. My apologies, sir, but we truly do need this vehicle, Schneider said, doffing his hat and bowing politely. However, as his gaze fell on Josh's face, he paused, visibly taken aback. Young man, what is your relation to Heinz Kahn? Schneider asked, his tone curious. Josh froze. Heinz Kahn was the name of his late father. You knew my father? Josh asked, frowning. Indeed. That must make you Josh Kahn. I'm Erwin Lyndon Schneider, a friend of your father's, the old man replied. Oh, I know who you are. We were just on the same front page this morning, Josh thought. Still, if Schneider could accurately name his father, his claim might hold some truth. The man's Bavarian accent, his German surname, and his old-fashioned manners seemed consistent with someone who might have been acquainted with Josh's Austrian family. But I don't recall my father ever mentioning a criminal friend, Josh said with a hint of sarcasm. And I certainly don't think any friend of his would aim a gun at his child. Fair enough. If I were a father, I wouldn't tell my child about such a friend either, Schneider admitted without offense. Then he turned to the tall man. Dix, lower the gun. The tall man, Dix, complied without hesitation. Apologies, young man, Schneider said, addressing Josh. Our situation is dire. The police are hunting us, and we're left with no choice but to borrow your vehicle. Rest assured, you can report this incident to the authorities, and I trust they'll treat you fairly. In the meantime, please accept this as compensation. To Josh's surprise, Schneider opened his leather bag and pulled out a handful of uncut diamonds, placing them in Josh's hands. For a moment, Josh was at a loss. The car was valuable. His Lincoln Continental was a gift from Margaret and held sentimental value. But the jewels Schneider had handed over were worth several times that amount. As he weighed the diamonds in his palm, an idea began to take shape in Josh's mind. As Schneider and Dix started the car's engine, Josh spoke. I believe you might need a place to lay low. Chapter 38. We once accidentally killed an athlete. The elderly Lyndon Schneider and the burly Dix were both fugitives. Naturally, Josh couldn't risk taking them to his own home. That would not only endanger Margaret but also himself. Instead, he brought them to his late parents' old apartment. Though Josh had long planned to sell the place, it had never been successfully sold. Bringing the two fugitives there was a calculated move. If they were eventually caught and ratted him out, Josh could argue his innocence convincingly. For instance, he could claim that Lyndon Schneider, being an old friend of his father, knew about the address and had access to the keys. This would distance Josh from the situation entirely. So long as Josh stuck to this narrative, even if the two wanted to implicate him, the police and courts wouldn't have enough to convict him. Besides, if they had any sense, Schneider and Dix would be unlikely to blame Josh. Though they had stolen a significant amount of jewels, according to the morning papers, no one had been killed during the heist, except for a security guard who had suffered minor injuries. As long as they hadn't committed murder, the law of this time wouldn't treat their crime as a severe offense, especially since they were white men. At most, they might face a few years in prison. By establishing good relations, Josh might even be able to help them get out early. What good would betraying him accomplish? Upon arrival, Josh casually chatted with the building supervisor, pretending to inquire about the apartment's sale status. Meanwhile, Schneider and Dix slipped past unnoticed, heading upstairs. Josh joined them shortly afterward to unlock the door and let them in. Thankfully, they encountered no one during the process. I spoke to the building supervisor. The police conducted a search here earlier today, so this place should be safe for now, Josh said after locking the door behind them. Thank you very much, young man, Schneider said, bowing stiffly. Don't thank me just yet, Josh waved him off. First, explain yourselves. What's your situation? The papers implied there were more of you. I assume the gunshots I heard near Lakeside earlier were connected to your group. And how exactly did you know my father? Schneider and Dix exchanged glances. After a brief hesitation, they told Josh the full story. It turned out that Josh's earlier suspicions were correct. The heist was indeed connected to attorney Emery, who was one of the masterminds. Schneider himself was the other. The entire affair began a month earlier when Schneider had just been released from prison. The newly freed criminal mastermind wasted no time heading to Chicago, where he approached a local fixer named Corby. Schneider proposed a lucrative business opportunity that required manpower and a buyer. The job was the theft of the Liebler family's jewel vault. With Schneider's reputation for intelligence and reliability, Corby eagerly introduced him to a high-profile client, attorney Emery. Emery not only agreed to fund the operation but also promised to purchase the stolen jewels at above market value. Tempted by the high payout, Schneider agreed. He quickly assembled a team, which included Dix and 3 others, Lewis, Goss, and Cody. Initially, the heist went smoothly. However, things took a turn when a security guard stumbled upon their escape route. Though Dix managed to knock the guard unconscious, the man's firearm accidentally discharged, hitting Lewis. Forced to split up to avoid capture, Goss took the injured Lewis to a back alley doctor. Schneider, Dix, and Cody went to meet Emery to exchange the goods for payment. This explained why Emery had hastily left the gala the previous evening after John Liebler's departure. He was preparing to receive the stolen goods. However, Emery had no intention of paying. Strapped for cash and on the verge of bankruptcy, the attorney planned to double-cross Schneider and flee to Mexico with the jewels. But Emery had underestimated his adversaries. Schneider might have been a nonviolent criminal, but Dix and Cody were not. The confrontation left Emery's trusted enforcer, Bob Brano, dead at Dix's hands. Though Dix and Cody were ready to kill Emery as well, Schneider stopped them. Recognizing their precarious position, without a buyer and unable to fence such high-value jewels, Schneider proposed a new plan. He suggested Emery negotiate with the insurance company. If they offered the jewels at a lower price, the company might privately buy them back to offset their payout to the Liebler family. Emery reluctantly agreed, disposing of his accomplice's body in the process. But things didn't end there. Unknown to Schneider, the police had been keeping tabs on him since his release from prison. Combined with pressure from the Liebler's family and city officials, a warrant was issued for Schneider's arrest, even without solid evidence linking him to the crime. Shortly after leaving Emery's estate, Schneider and Dix found themselves tailed by police. In the ensuing chaos, Cody sacrificed himself to lead the authorities away, allowing Schneider and Dix to escape, only to run into Josh. During Schneider's recounting, he repeatedly emphasized his close relationship with Josh's father. He even claimed that he had helped the family immigrate to the United States. Josh remained skeptical but couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility. After all, Schneider had accurately described his father's past and handed him a bag of diamonds without hesitation. Given the circumstances, extending a helping hand seemed reasonable. After some thought, Josh offered his advice. "If you trust me, your best option is to surrender," he said. "Why?" Schneider asked, puzzled. "From what you've told me, Emery is a key player in all of this. If you align your story and pin the blame on him, I can talk to John Liebler on your behalf. Once he learns his legal advisor is a traitor, he'll likely help you out. If we can make Emery the scapegoat, you'll only be charged as accomplices. With mitigating factors like surrendering and cooperation, I can get you a good lawyer. You might not even serve time, just a light sentence with the possibility of parole. Isn't that better than running for the rest of your lives?" Schneider fell silent, contemplating the proposal. Josh's logic was sound, but he couldn't help gripping the bag of jewels tighter, reluctant to part with them. "Sir, it's not that simple," Dix interjected. "Our current heist might not have caused any serious harm, but I won't lie to you, we accidentally killed a tennis player about 2 weeks ago. Plus, we've got a few other skeletons in our closet. Surrendering won't be as easy as you think." Josh's jaw dropped, and he choked on his drink, coughing violently. Chapter 39. John Liebler's surprise. "Mr. Kahn, are you all right?" Seeing Josh suddenly cough violently, both Lyndon Schneider and Dix looked at him with genuine concern. After all, Josh was quickly becoming their only hope. "Cough, cough, I'm fine. Just choked on my own saliva." Josh waved it off, signaling that he was okay. He then turned his attention to Dix, scrutinizing him up and down. "So, it's the good guy." He mentally kicked himself for not recognizing him earlier. In fairness, though, The other night, he had been observing them from over 30 meters away in the dim glow of early dawn. The streetlights of this era weren't exactly known for their brightness, so failing to identify anyone's face was understandable. Sir, does my situation trouble you? It's all right. I can leave right now. Mr. Schneider and my past actions are unrelated. Let him go and turn himself in, Dix said, standing up when he noticed Josh staring at him. That won't be necessary, Josh said, lost in thought. Your other cases do complicate things a little, but it's not insurmountable. Worst case, I can arrange for a boat to get you to Canada. You can lay low there for a while until the situation cools off. Normally, Josh wouldn't bother going out of his way to help someone like Dix. Frankly, if Lyndon Schneider hadn't been connected to his father, Josh wouldn't have lifted a finger to help either, especially not after being threatened at gunpoint. But Dix's actions spoke volumes. Not only had he protected Schneider throughout the ordeal, but the loyalty and camaraderie he'd shown earlier, standing up for the older man, had softened Josh's stance. After all, as Lyndon Schneider had explained, he and Dix's group had only known each other for less than a week. They weren't close associates, just individuals brought together by a short-term deal. According to their agreement, the heist spoils, all those valuable jewels, belonged entirely to Schneider. Dix and his team were only hired for a fixed fee of $20,000 per person. Yet despite this limited arrangement, Dix and his men not only refrained from coveting the jewels but risked their lives to protect Schneider, even now going so far as to advocate for him. Such loyalty was unexpected. Josh couldn't help but marvel at how, in this era, even hardened criminals seemed to have a strong sense of honor. Wouldn't that be too much trouble? Dix asked, clearly surprised by Josh's suggestion. Under normal circumstances, it would be a hassle, Josh replied. But you're not the primary target here, Mr. Schneider, and the jewels are. If he turns himself in, and the pressure from the Liebler family and the insurance company eases, the police will be eager to close the case. Once the citywide lockdown lifts, smuggling you out will be much easier. Hearing this, Dix, who had been on edge for over 24 hours, finally relaxed a little, sinking back into the sofa. However, as soon as he sat, he winced, clutching his side and letting out a sharp breath. Are you injured? Josh raised an eyebrow and noticed the blood-soaked area near Dix's waist as he lifted his shirt. The entire lower part of his undershirt was stained deep red. It's nothing. Just a graze from a bullet. I've already dressed it, Dix said, shaking his head. Josh wasn't buying it. There was no way a simple graze would bleed so profusely or cause such visible pain. If you don't stop the bleeding, it's going to get serious, Josh said as he inspected the wound. But you're in luck. With that, he walked into the bedroom, returning shortly with a medical kit. Of course, only Josh knew that the kit had come from his system's storage space. As a time traveler, he made it a priority to stay prepared for any situation, especially in an era as unpredictable as this one. While life in the United States was relatively stable, it didn't hurt to be cautious. Thanks to the system's storage capabilities, he didn't have to worry about space or expiration dates. Inside the kit were basic supplies, bandages, simple tools, and medications, including morphine and sulfa powder. Unfortunately, there was no penicillin. Although Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, it wasn't immediately recognized for its potential. It wasn't until 1940 that its antibacterial properties were confirmed, and large-scale production only began in 1942, after U.S. pharmaceutical companies got involved. Even now, penicillin was still a regulated experimental drug. For now, sulfa drugs were the best available option. With no professionals among them, the three men resorted to a straightforward and crude method. Dix bit down on a rag while Josh sprinkled sulfa powder onto the wound, administered 5 milligrams of morphine, and wrapped the injury with fresh bandages. Yes, morphine had addictive properties, but dosage was key. Modern research showed that doses under 5 milligrams were relatively safe. The rampant addiction seen among soldiers during World War I and II resulted primarily from the life-saving practice of administering large, 30-milligram doses. This is all I can do for now. Stay here and rest. Later, I'll see if I can bring in a doctor. Mr. Schneider, you'll come with me to meet Mr. Liebler, Josh said after securing Dix's bandage. He'd done everything he could for Dix, the rest was in the man's own hands. Thank you, sir, Dix said earnestly. Josh simply smiled. Thank yourself, he said cryptically, leaving Dix puzzled. Without explaining further, Josh and Schneider left. Before departing, Josh made a quick phone call to confirm John Liebler's whereabouts. Since the theft involved the renowned attorney Emery and the Liebler family's long-standing partner, it was crucial to notify Liebler in advance. Liebler's stance would be key to reducing Schneider's sentence. At the moment, John Liebler was swamped with the aftermath of the theft. Although the insurance company would cover the direct financial loss, the stolen gems represented a significant portion of the company's inventory, and replacing them during wartime wouldn't be easy. Initially, when Liebler's secretary informed him of Josh's request for a meeting, he was reluctant. However, remembering Josh's heroics the previous night and the favorable press coverage that morning, he realized Josh's influence was growing. Chapter 40. A small incident 2 hours later, Josh and John Liebler stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in Liebler's office, watching as Lyndon Schneider was escorted into a police car. Although Schneider had already received John Liebler's forgiveness, the case had attracted significant attention, necessitating some formalities. Schneider would need to spend some time in the police holding facility, though it was almost certain he wouldn't end up in prison. Josh, I really can't thank you enough for this. John Liebler expressed his gratitude with genuine warmth. His thanks were sincere. Schneider's decision to turn himself in had resolved a significant problem for Liebler, not merely the stolen jewels. While the jewels were touted as being worth $1 million, anyone familiar with the jewelry industry would know that the production cost was less than 30% of that value. For the wealthy Liebler family, such a loss was relatively minor, merely an inconvenience in replenishing stock and a loss of indirect profits. What truly pleased John Liebler was the exposure of Emery as a major insider threat, particularly before the police had discovered it. As a lawyer who had worked with the Liebler family for decades, Emery had access to a wealth of confidential information about the Liebler group. If this information were to leak, it would result in losses far greater than the theft of jewels. Had the police uncovered Emery's role in the case first, it could have led to unforeseen complications. Josh's decision to bring Schneider to John Liebler for reconciliation before involving the police proved to be a fortunate and timely move, giving Liebler sufficient time to clean up any sensitive loose ends. Haha, Uncle John, there's no need to be so formal. You're Margaret's uncle, and that makes you mine too. We're family. Josh replied tactfully. Yes, we're family. John Liebler was momentarily startled before bursting into laughter. He clapped Josh on the shoulder, clearly delighted. Yesterday, Josh's public gesture of purchasing war bonds had improved Liebler's impression of him. Now, Liebler truly saw Josh in a favorable light. He couldn't help but think that Margaret had chosen wisely this time. Father, I heard. Why are you here? At that moment, John Liebler's second son, David Liebler, barged in. Upon seeing Josh, his face immediately darkened. What kind of behavior is this? Can't you see I have a guest? Where are your manners? John Liebler's anger flared at his son's rude demeanor. Compared to Josh, who displayed maturity far beyond his years, Liebler's 30-something younger son was a constant source of frustration. Fortunately, John had never pinned his hopes on this frivolous, womanizing son. His eldest son, who managed the family's businesses across several eastern states, was the true heir to the family legacy. David, accustomed to his father's reprimands, merely shrugged it off and reluctantly greeted Josh. Josh, unbothered, bid farewell to John Liebler and left the Liebler group. Having already informed Margaret of his whereabouts, he didn't rush home. Instead, he stopped to buy food and supplies to take to Dix, ensuring the man wouldn't starve before his injuries had a chance to heal. As he walked through the streets, Josh noticed that the police checkpoints, which had been everywhere just a day before, were gone. Only the usual patrol officers remained. It was clear that with Schneider's surrender and the resolution of the jewelry theft case, the police were eager to close the matter and move on. You look much better, Josh remarked when he arrived at the apartment and saw Dix looking healthier. Dix's gunshot wound was a through-and-through injury that hadn't hit any organs. As long as the bleeding had stopped and there was no infection, a doctor's visit might not even be necessary. Yes, the bleeding has stopped. Thank you so much, Mr. Karn. What's the situation outside? Dix thanked Josh before asking about the outside world. There's good news and bad news, Josh replied. The good news is that the police have withdrawn, so you don't need to worry about being hunted or fleeing to Canada. That is good news. And the bad news? Dix nodded, bracing himself. Your companion Cody was killed in a shootout with the police, Josh said, shrugging as he shared the information he had gleaned from the police. Lewis and Goss. Dix sighed heavily at Cody's death. Though he had expected the possibility, hearing the news still weighed on him. However, he quickly composed himself and inquired about his other partners. The police didn't mention them, so they likely weren't caught, Josh replied. Thank you. Dix expressed his gratitude. Knowing his other companions were safe gave him some solace. All right, don't overthink it. Rest up. I'll check on you tomorrow. Leaving the food and supplies behind, Josh departed. After spending so much time out, Margaret was probably worried. Sure enough, when Josh returned home, Margaret asked about his visit to the Liebler group. Josh didn't hide anything, recounting his chance encounter with Lyndon Schneider, his connection to Josh's father, and how he convinced Schneider to surrender. Emery orchestrated all this. That's unbelievable, Margaret remarked, shocked to learn that someone they knew was behind the theft. However, knowing that the situation had been resolved put her at ease. Josh also thought the matter was settled. But there was still a twist to come. The next morning, the newspapers reported that the jewelry theft case had been solved. Alongside the news of Schneider's surrender, two additional developments caught Josh off guard. First, Emery had shot himself before the police could apprehend him. Second, a middleman named Corby, apprehended by Officer Dietrich, confessed to the involvement of everyone, including Emery. This led the police to Lewis's home the same night. However, they found him gravely injured and already dead. Only one accomplice, Goss, was arrested. Now, Dix was the only one still at large. Fortunately, for Josh, this small twist didn't pose any real issues. Support the original author by checking out their book. Links in the description.